Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mongol invasion of Europe in a bit of a different way. Last year I made a mini-series about the Mongols as a manual history introduction to the broader, in fact, Mongol era, let's say, so passing through the conquest of the several Eurasian domains that the Mongols seized at the time and or lorded on. This difference is also meaningful because many ways at the time there was no such thing like any kind of literally centralized or strictly centralized government, and most of the empires that we see also at much shorter range really function in different ways. This is not much the point, but this is for saying that we have already observed what was the nature of the Mongolian Empire, not just that one, and the, let's say, the ABC of what properly the conquest had been. You know that I don't make what ifs, uchronic narratives and so on, because I think that I could make actually an entire video to explain why I don't make what ifs, but to make the long story short, I think that history is already too complex the way it is to, let's say, waste time presenting kind of alternative scenarios that elude from some kind of likelihood in the short term, and all the rest is somewhat starts being too unpredictable. And this is something that gets down really to what humanity has always done, right? We have tried to predict the future and also to look at the past and said, well, what if, this thing had gone differently? But given that there is no, say, politically, economically, whatever, any usefulness, like any capacity of marketing predictions of what the world will be in even 4 months, which is literally our horizon, in practice, well, the same thing goes for the past, where things were not really simpler than today. That is, at least the dimension of unpredictability is such that in terms of human prediction, not even action, doesn't make a difference. So trying to answer the question, what would have happened had attempted the subjugation of Europe in her entirety, is of relative importance. Today, however, I want to make an exception and not trying to outline what would have happened, let's say, but what in part were the things that we can observe regarding the actual, historical Mongolian attitude towards the matter, because von Clausewitz, first of all, teaches us just to remain in the strictly military, and in this case strategic, but we'll talk tactics too, side of the story. Let's say probabilities are by themselves strategic reality. That is to say, even when when you're acting, of course, you are somewhat predicting what can the enemy do, and even if this has not happened, there is a kind of reasonable dimension that you're saying, if I do this, the enemy does that, and that imaginary reality that has not yet happened is by itself an important quantity in the strategic affair. So there are some aspects about this that are applicable also to politics in general, and in the proper operational practice and the strategy and even the tactics that the Mongols employed in the actual invasion of Europe that happened, right? The Mongols fundamentally stopped in Germany, in Italy, and this was the the Isthmus. Of course, there were only some kind of minor contingents that at some point crossed into Germany, even in the south, beyond the Alps. But as you know, it's mostly the Central and especially Eastern Europe that bore the brunt of the Mongol invasions. That still, however, were not directed, even in to permanent conquest slash occupation, and naturally there was a sort of, as I was saying before, decentralized control, and this speaks a lot about lots of things. Also, if you consider what were the spaces involved, even just what was the step, where were the step in all this, and what were the territories that were occupied, not occupied, and so on. So this is an incredibly complex topic for one reason. First of all, it's politics, and so as I said before, it's something extremely fluid, ever-changing. So it would require lots of videos just on assessing the entire history of, say, even just Eastern Europe from the Mongolian conquest at the end of the Middle Ages. Let's put it in these boundaries, and we may do that, right? I don't have it planned, but we could start looking a bit more also at the Golden Horde, and I think I never made a video about it, telling the truth. A bit of Russian history as well regarding that essentially relation of dependency on the Mongols, because that's what actually happened since the invasion. So, and even more so, we can't talk about campaigns that didn't happen. Yes, there were things like Poland being invaded 3 times up to the 14th century. This kind of broader threat that also many other peoples were under the Mongols. This is yet another very important aspect that is dramatically overlooked. Like, the Mongols didn't rule this empire alone, right? They were floating on other subject peoples that, yes, they had brought under, but as I have explained countless times, without the support of which the Mongol Empire or any other empire or any other polity or by a larger degree of any community could have ever even existed. And in this scenario, you have to understand, in fact, what these populations had to gain, in a sense, from this scenery, and or what instead would have brought to a relentless struggle and resistance against them. And today's video wants to be rather kind of not even disclosure one, but let's say one that aims at or a question and answer video for that matter, but still answering some of the commonest misconceptions and or prejudices existing regarding this problem, because first of all, not all Ukrainians are the same, right? Some are more Uchronic than others, and this one about the eventual Mongol conquest of Europe and or just further invasions, maybe just aimed at raiding and so on deep into the west, are, let's say, one of the most examined in history. Like, this is also kind of strange, because medieval times normally do not attract so much attention regarding, especially that kind of grand plans. And as I was explaining the other day, quoting that human disgrace of a little heart, the Mongols have been seen, not that they didn't deserve that reputation, but not just, in fact, as some of the most successful armies in history, and definitely at least one of the first in the Middle Ages, but at the same time, something more, like a military culture that didn't even belong to the Middle Ages. There are some authors I could quote that literally say that the Mongols were bringing some kind of modern warfare into medieval Europe. This is insanity, right? It's proper historical illiteracy and lack of strategic culture to core, right? And I come from, again, a series, as we've seen in the last days, in which I have talked a lot about Mongol warfare. So if you're interested in that, and you know that I have a substantial appreciation towards, so I don't really have a bias, I think, but I'm aware of the fact that historiographically there is a sense of making fireworks. These are the things like the military revolution in the modern age and Renaissance that, I don't know how to tell you, never happened. There's not been any form of military revolution during the Renaissance or the early modern age, or wherever you want to set the boundaries. But people kind of consume this stuff without understanding also nothing about them, these works are not naturally just taking the matter in adequate consideration, and so everything gets somewhat distorted in ways that you wouldn't like to know if you're especially interested in something a bit more concrete. But the broader consensus, I think, among the experts specifically, is undoubtedly that the Mongol conquest of Europe, but even if just the invasion of the West would have not been, first of all, even in the Mongol interest in the first place, and that's part of the reason why it was likely unfeasible. The Mongols acknowledged this, and this is also part of the reason why they didn't go further. In spite of, again, of the political issues that, as you know, were concerning the retreat of all the Mongol forces to the Kuraltai because of the imperial succession. But there would have been other chances to do it, and also, yes, everything was extremely complicated to the point of course, not making it happen. It could happen later on as well. There were threats that the Mongols launched against the West that were also somewhat ridiculed, but it's not that it was too much to joke about, aside from the fact that, of course, peoples at the time were aware of their military potential, but they knew they would have to put up an intense struggle. The point being that it would have been feasible in the 40s, in the 50s, to still wage an important series of campaigns against Europe. And let's say the reason why this was not done was likely that there was no intent to or systematically subjugate this area, because there were no chances to think to control it on the longer term. And so investing on such a huge effort, first of all, implies having at least a leverage on which to make such an enormous effort, and at that point this didn't quite seem to exist. So as you understand, all these statements would require a video per each. That is to say, how did these peoples, for example, saw the world, the other peoples inhabiting it, and what kind of, even on top of their experience having subjugated, in fact, the largest amount of territories contiguously in the history of mankind, even to come, right? How they would see Europe. And the main problem, of course, as that every historian would tell you, is that we don't know what the Mongols actually thought of Europe, right? We don't have a nice document saying, this is a shitty place, I don't like how they eat, or whatever, of course, from a Mongol perspective. And you would be surprised by, how different, in a sense, of course, the Mongol world was from, not just obviously from China, in other countries that in fact they did conquer for good, but with the West and Europe. I made a video last year that was probably about the Western thought in this phase, especially the one open with the Pax Mongolica, and so all the travels that were rendered possible in great quantities, in fact, in great volumes, during the 13th century to China, in this enormously extended territory ruled by the Mongols, and how Europeans would already have a completely different attitude than the rest of the world to the rest of the world, which is quite unique in my opinion, and it manifests definitely the already a dramatic advancement that was reflected, surely, and that's where we tend to overlook the development of Western Europe at the time. in any other field, politically, militarily, socially, etc., in the event, in fact, of a Mongol conquest. Excuse me, to drink a little. So, there are objectively substantive aspects that are too controversial in the broader knowledge that we have from those times for us to carry out a decent eukaryotic analysis, right? We just don't. Like if you ask me about some things of World War II, like at least there we have a much better understanding of how things work. We have quantities, we have an idea also of the moral forces involved by a sounder degree, and so we can explain things better. Like about 13th century Eurasia, well, there is really too few for us to make this kind of assessment. So we can't just look at, let's say, the broader purposes, like what this would have entailed for the Mongols in very broad terms, what this could have turned like in logistical, political, military terms, even what was banal, even the tactics that would have been employed in this attempt of subjugating and or terrorizing and controlling Europe by some larger degree, right? So one thing that is very important looking just at a map of the world. I don't like geopolitics by far because simply it does not exist, but it can offer some food for thought for some dynamics. If you look at the apex of the Mongol Empire, you realize that, first of all, Mongolia is dramatically shifted to the east compared to, yes, most of the territories that it extensionally controlled. But Mongolia is fundamentally over China, right? It's bordering it. There was a huge frontier that was, at some point, you couldn't really even distinguish who was Chinese or who was Mongol, and what the hell does that even mean in a strictly political or cultural or even ethnic sense. And so it's as if you had, like, imagine in other times in history, like think about the Viking era, right? In extremely different terms, those were just pirates fundamentally that managed to profit, if anything, of the same weakness of the northern European continental political military structures, and they just essentially existed in virtue of that internal disintegration that was happening there all the time. But there you have an obvious understanding. The closer you are, in a way, the more you're facilitated to intervene, right? Operationally, politically, logistically. So for the Mongols, the obvious comparison is, the Mongols conquered China, so they had some mean to deal with the government of more advanced civilization in a sedentary space with a different demographic concentration, and so on, right? So they could have done it theoretically with Europe, except Europe is several thousands of kilometers away. And not only that, in between Europe and Mongolia, there is basically, and that was the corridor that had always connected, in fact, longitudinally, these very distant areas of Eurasia, of the steppes. That is the one that the Mongols actually use as the highway to actually also reach, to move through, also facilitated by the fact that at lower latitudes, of course, the globe shrinks, so eventually you can descend towards the equator, towards the various areas that you want to reach, preferably from there. So deeply important area because it was a steppe area. So the same environment, the same, let's say, oil wells, let's say the same place where the Mongolian oil wells laid, right? Because the Mongolians lived essentially as a steppe nomadic people. So their capacity of moving in the steppes was like nobody else's. This corridor was extremely useful to reach all the places you wanted, the Middle East, Europe. Consider that India was not penetrated, and they left it basically alone, and that also certain parts actually of Southeast Asia and even some parts of China were not actually controlled in that kind of direct way. So you can see there what the limits really are. But when you look at the westernmost one, you realize that in Europe the Mongol conquests proper, because eventually various powers there that you can't conceive as Mongols, even though, for example, there is a strong Turkic component. Think about the Khanate of the Golden Horde, we talked about Volga Bulgars and so on, ends in the steppe, right? It's most of today's southern Russia and Ukraine and parts of Caucasus, and that's in fact where, especially north of Caucasus, the Mongolian armies were based during most of these operations. So you're looking at basically arriving up to the Carpathians at the limits of the open Eurasian steppes. It is true that in Hungary there is the westernmost opening, let's say, of the Eurasian steppes that reach in Manchuria to the other side, and that even though Hungary was invaded, the area was not used was not occupied by the Mongols, right? That retreated at that point. So the overlapping of the steppe area, as opposed to the one of the forests in the north, especially in Europe, is a powerful indicator of the fact that even if, for example, the Russians destroyed most of Rus. After that, eventually also the most successful Russian principalities later on, chiefly Moscow, were literally a Mongol creation, and grew up as such, because otherwise it would have not even had much of steam on their own. And this deeply informed the entire culture of the time. What you see, and we have studied also military-wise, is that the Mongol armies didn't really even venture that much north. Right, even the world of the forest, and we're talking about the Eastern European forest, so some basically of the most underdeveloped, underpopulated, underproductive places in Europe, were kind of off limits, or at least the Mongols wouldn't venture in them, because in spite of all this, they were populated by communities that wouldn't allow for that kind of permanent settlement / occupation, because it was not simply worth it, right? It was not even too much to control, and cavalry doesn't work pretty well in forests, and in areas where that literal worth of the Mongol core divisions, let's say, would be wasted, especially compared to much richer areas of Europe, though that, however, at the same time are still also more distant. The same can be said for the Middle East, right? If you look at the Mongolian borders, you really see in Kingizid times that they didn't reach essentially even the core land of Anatolia, right? They didn't even take over the entire Mesopotamia that remained kind of a great frontier. They tried to occupy Syria and they failed on the long run, with defeats and victories against the Mamluks. So what they were approaching there too, like just in the in Central Europe when they tried to move fast, was essentially a different type of civilization that is actually marked, as we will see now, by more dense population, important urbanization, actually important warlikeness. I mean, a degree of military culture that starts being really, really impressive. And what is usually not really appreciated of all this is that in between that and Mongolia, there isn't much like a base of Mongolian, nomadic military power. That is to say, the steppes are there, yes, but what you have in between the steppes is not enough in terms of local resources to provide with that kind of immediate, okay, we simply will base ourselves here, even just as a Mongol, right? If you go in Kazakhstan or Russia, it's not, say, north of the Caucasus, you're not really home, right? You can eventually settle there and stuff, but these are not particularly developed areas, and there is no way to sustain from there an invasion of such an overwhelmingly concentrated amount of people, wealth, and power like you have in Europe and the Mediterranean. So you have to organize the whole thing essentially from this magic core of Mongolia, where again these people extremely overloaded in moral force, has managed to take over the world, but that on the long run is going to be worn out, right? And has much better places it can aim at, and namely having, first of all, the big challenge of controlling China. When you look at the various powers that form also from the split of the Mongolian empire, you have essentially the Chinese one, you have the Iranian one, the Ilkhanate, you have a Central Asian power that it's a bit the bitch of the situation, because it's actually the weaker by some degree, but it controls the Silk Road continentally, and therefore it draws a lot of power from it in a sense. And then you have the Khanate of the Golden Horde, so-called, later, that has a substantial power on its own, right? It's comparable to the Ilkhanate by some degree, and that can, and that all these remain in contact. There is a sort of Mongol coinage that naturally maintains even the idea that broader expeditions can be organized and so on, but these are fundamentally also competitive powers based on previous regional bases that do not quite have, especially after the moment of Mongolian sedentarization, much of that previous load to systematically subjugate essentially the same people on which they are ruling from, and that they must necessarily integrate in order to maintain control of. And we've seen it just the other day with Mahmud Ghazan, the first Ilkhan to convert to Islam, regarding the invasion of Syria and so on. So things, as you know, go complicated, and you can argue that not much remains of the previous Mongolian unity, right? It's the comparison I always make. Think about the Islamic invasions. It's not that Arabia changed because of Islamic invasion. It changed in the sense that the world grows, but Arabia remained more or less the same comparatively also to the rest of the places that the Arabs conquered, like it was until the 20th century, right? And what we call as Arabs, that were actually just Arabicized elites in places that were, in fact, already like prosper on their own. Read Mesopotamia, Egypt, Tunisia, by some degree Spain. Eventually became the seat of that kind of Arab power, but it had really a few of Arab in practice, also because what we call Arab, especially in arts, etc., it's either Persian, Hellenic, Roman, Indian, and more, right? Because again, Arabia was not the seat of what you would call like an advanced civilization, except parts of the south that were more developed, but those were not the ones that participated in practice to the invasions, to the conquest. Those were the Bedouins of the Hijaz, of the desert. So I think this is an important premise, because if you want to, say, take over Europe, the first thing you have to realize that it's where from, right? And from Mongolia, with such a scarce and loose control of the western steppes, that again can be, yes, subjugated, namely, but they cannot really give you too much in terms of resources, supplies, unless you maintain the unity of the whole empire. So you're doing this because you have a force that is able to wield power on not just Europe, but on the entirety of, say, China, the Middle East, Central Asia. You can't think to sustain on a prolonged time an offensive and a repeated one, right? That would take at least a generation to subjugate against such an importantly populated area in the westernmost chunk of Eurasia, right? And we will see now what this also entails practically. So an important point to start from is Russia, because this region was conquered and subdued, right? 1 year after Liegnitz in 1243, when the Mongols defeated, as you know, the Polish-German coalition. However, Russia, as we were saying before, was not practically occupied. This is true both for the actual Rus, the center at least of what had been Kievan power, so roughly today's Ukraine, parts of Belarus, and for the wilder northeastern, properly Russian world that was actually also much less developed than that. Right? I made a video about the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia that explains the strained relations of these powers with the Mongols that, yes, were overlords, but they didn't quite rule from there. They had to periodically from the east, and that's where essentially the Khanate had already settled in the easternmost frontier. Again, is the steppe. This is crucial, right? There is properly a boundary between what the Mongols can rule and control. It's essentially steppe one, overlapping with properly the climatological area of the steppe, and the world still, part of the forest already, right? And that is essentially central western Ukraine. Today, Belarus and so on. We made a video also about about Lithuania in the same period that as you know expanded in Ruthenia. And that's the history that brings eventually the areas that now we call Ukraine. It was actually the Russian Palatinate into first, in fact, Lithuania, and after in modern age under Poland as a consequence. And those are areas that were not ruled, say, by were directly governed by the Mongols. Those were just tributary states, fundamentally, that were in a condition of vassalage, of which they also profited. And those areas were also much more connected with Europe than we normally think. Today, I will not say they were Europe, as a matter of fact. The Russian Palatinate had, differently from, Russia, like in terms of the Muscovy and so on, big connections with Hungary, even with Germany, with Poland, and so it was part of a broader Central European reality that, because of the Cold War, because of socialism and so on, we have, yes, normally in the West used to think as a different thing by approximation, but that in historical perspective cannot be understood that way. And as I was saying before, like, how do you explain the fact that Russia, for example, was not occupied as it happened with China, right? And a lot of this has to do with that bigger dimension, that the broader power base of the Mongolian tribes was not near at all, as opposed to China, that the Mongols had been essentially penetrating from centuries. I made a video about the Karakitai that actually are the predecessors of the Mongols, that show actually a very important military development, for example. On paper, even more evolved, so considering we're talking about the 12th century, than the later Kingizid one, because, for example, this Karakitai armies figured prominently a very consistent amount of infantry, of halberdiers, of tactical segmentation, of combined arms, whereas Kingizid armies were mostly just cavalry, right? Naturally, afterwards, when they conquered China, they also drew, as you know, much more than that. The Mongols were not just completely primitive brutes without anything, but there were, let's say, different shades of development and civilization within the same Mongolia. So, of course, paying a tribute is not the same as being conquered. So already the fact that the Eastern European areas that the Mongols kind of occupied either were so temporarily, and or they just belonged to actually the world of the steppes, that you can argue, at least geographically, yes, up to the Urals, at least that also start north of that, but still longitudinally, is that Europe, culturally wise, right? And there is a debate on this. In terms of what we're thinking, of course, the Mongols invading Europe, right? This is crucial to understand, and you know that European sedentarism, in many ways, especially in Eastern Europe, but also in the central one, even up to places like Germany. I mean, let's be honest, that world, that kind of semi-nomadic world, does end there in Central Europe. We have a sense that, I don't know, we again on the base of the Cold War division, that everything, say, that is, say, from in fact from west of the Iron Curtain is Western Europe strictly meant. But we have been deprived of the radical concept that, Western Europe is countries like Britain, France, also in a deep cultural sense. Germany already is not Western Europe. Germany is eminently Central Europe. It's properly a culture on its own. It's something else. Naturally, if you want to diversify a lot, it's still part of the broader Western world, and this is exactly what we're all actually focusing as such, as something inherently different from the Mongol one. But there are important differences as well between these countries. And at the time, they were not so different. Like before the Mongols, even the same Rus was much more similar to countries like, in fact, Central Europe than Eastern Europe. Much of what we properly consider as Eastern Europe has to do with the Mongolian legacy, the deeply informed Russian culture in literally one of the most intimate veins of its culture. And that is something importantly different from what also the same peoples that inhabited there were used to before those times, and the actually traumatic senioralization, privatization, and collapse of all what the institutional process of the Rus really was about was changed, was injected, was properly created at that point, right? And perhaps I will make a video about this. As you know, I have actually a series on Ukrainian history, so you can check that out. And when you look at Poland and Hungary, well, these suffered a similar fate. Basically, they were devastated, but not occupied, right? Not even in later times. Although, as we were saying before, Hungary was the last offshoot of the steppe, 8,000 kilometers from Manchuria to Hungary, right? And I should point out that these countries, in spite of I think the Mongol invasions were very destructive, especially in Poland, in Hungary too, but at least the Hungarians seem to have, during the 13th century, to have been the country that somewhat revived the most, right? I'm not saying that Hungary was, there's probably some steppe reason why they did at the same time, because that kind of oligarchic mentality and culture, that's still that proximity to the steppe, even the presence of nomadic peoples within the same Hungary that were settled on purpose by the monarchy to counter the nobility, had made Hungary really something else, even compared to other Central European standards, especially in the north, that were instead much more strictly, properly sedentary-minded peoples from a much longer time. But in this broader Central and Eastern European sector, you realize that the transition from politics of conquest to that of vassalage was the decisive strategic choice of the Mongols that is often underestimated, and which implies the fact that the Mongols were the first to understand that they could not expand beyond their conquests towards a West that was so far from their homeland, right? And testing those grounds had showed them anyway, because already Poland or Hungary would have been untenable on the longer run, even if they had tried, right, to maintain it. And also because, of course, they were exposed to the West, right? West of that, you have Germany, you have Italy. In the south, you have the Latin Empire. So we're talking about, and just speaking of Europe, not even of the problems that derive from controlling the Middle East and so on. And so areas, by the way, that also in this kind of north of the Black Sea and north of the Caucasus areas were on average even poorer than the south. But that may have been, in this case, really counterbalanced by the fact that we're closer to the steppes by some degree, or were properly steppes themselves. So the area would have become the next campaigning ground of the Crusaders, right? Just next door to also very politically and military organized countries, such as the Holy Roman Empire, and for not talking about any other crusader that would have joined. I mean, if we consider that the Europeans at the time were still in the Holy Land, and that they were holding important. You can imagine, what would have been like, having the Mongols next door, say in Hungary, in Poland, and by a certain degree, the countries that also say that the broader longitudinal spectrum of Europe does show a kind of history, in fact, of adaptation to this kind of Eastern instabilities. Because even for example, the Slavs and the other peoples that at different times had come to rule on them, like the Avars, the Magyars, and the Bulgars, had been a threat to the more sedentary world, in a way, right? The Byzantine Empire, the Carolingian Empire, other, the Merovingians, the Longobards, had been involved in this idea of properly stemming the Eastern troubling neighbor, not nomadic in the sense that they are literally living on horseback, etc., but just even semi-nomadic in the sense that they can escape as they could do when attacked back to the mountains, and they could have this greater mobility that allowed them flexibility, because the broader Central and Eastern European world compared to the Western one was, as we were saying before, less populated, poorer, less connected. There were less roads, there were less crops. It was just also in this sense wilder, meaning that there were less structures properly to centralize an effective control, which is something that, I don't know, even in the Middle East, the Mongols could arrive and say, okay, here there is an administration. If we crush their army, if we behead their government, basically we can install ourselves in this, and that was complicated to do, as we've seen already. If we speak of Iran, of Persia, the Mongols, yes, settled, but they had to importantly adapt to a strong local culture that somewhat also Persianized them, as also even just the caliphate had been Persianized and so on. And feudalism didn't help more than much. There is, as we will explain now, this idea that is also addressed by some sources of the time, that telling the truth, that is the fact that since there was not a real center of power in Europe, that yes, in theory there was an empire. Actually, there were two, but they weren't quite empires in a unitary sense. This would have been allegedly a weakness of Europe. Of course, if there had been the necessary energies to have a single European superpower at that point, probably also the response to the Mongols would have been stronger in a direct military confrontation with something comparable also in terms of military organization and so on. It would have been more fragile. This is if had it been defeated in one blow, right? So this is a bit like Machiavelli's point, that also is an overly simplified one about the Turk that has just one head, and so it's extremely powerful. But if you knock out his head, you can take over, the entire empire collapses. And instead, France, even if you kill his king, he has lots of other little principality states that will fight to the death, and so it will turn to be a nightmare, right? So there are pros and cons, but the substance of a civilization very often is beyond the form in that regard. And thus this fact that Europe was politically, feudally fragmented is not really, it was not really a weakness. If anything, as we have explained countless times, in explaining medieval civilization at levels that we do not address in this video, well, that was also the proof of an important vivacity, and in the fact that still Europe was able to organize herself altogether in that idea of cooperation and kind of federal unity that paradoxically is also what we are searching here today, because we evidently have something that can make it work on the base of a millenary tradition. So the bigger point in absolute terms is, again, Europe was too distant from Mongol centers of power, right? The logistical problems may seem complex and ambiguous to reconstruct historically speaking, but it's perhaps less tricky than it seems. It's not just logistical, right? Logistics is just an instrument. Here we're talking about the center of power, and the center of power literally meant also from a political point of view, a cultural point of view. What the Mongols did was possible because they were warlike tribes, and it's the same reason why the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented in different chunks, and so why nobody eventually attempted anymore to invade Europe in the same way. So paradoxically, what this means is that either you manage to settle in one place because the population fundamentally accepts for some reason or another to be governed by at that point what becomes rather a seigneury floating over a pre-existing establishment that accepts that, or there is no way you can kind of Mongolize the situation. And in China, again, that had already been done practically, right? Or at least it had been started as a process. It had been started not just with the Mongols, it had started with the Turks. It had started with other peoples, frankly, that had come to even rule in parts of China from a long time. And we don't have even time to digress on China in this sense. In Europe, this had not existed, right? At best, what had happened in Europe is that a bunch of steppe peoples, such as the Avars or the Bulgars or the Magyars, had at a point come to occupy some peripheral areas at the end of the day in Central and Eastern Europe that still lived at the outskirts of the actual European civilization in a sedentary sense, right? And that divide within the same Europe is also crucial. And what we see there is that there were just essentially several tens of thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands at some, depending on what you're considering and on which time you consider the migration spanning. But these peoples fundamentally dilute within the rest, especially in at least in those areas that in fact do not support a nomadic lifestyle. In Hungary, this lasts for like a bit longer, but Hungary is also kind of a European country, right? The majority of people are Europeans, even though still today the Ugro-Finnic language remains. The majority of the people are somewhat of Slavic background, and or of, yes, there is an important evidence, ethnically speaking, also of these conquerors that somewhat gathered there in the Pannonian Basin, but at the same time in the Hungarian plain, but it's still like overwhelmingly a kind of a European country, right? In an ethnocultural sense, and you can say that Europe is fundamentally defined traditionally by that. I mean, the entirety of what we consider Europe is that kind of homogeneous reality, without substantial exception. Not even in the far east of Europe, you have areas you can say, well, these are kind of hybrid, something else compared to other peoples. Yes, we have Turkey, but that's another story because it's more like a political thing than any kind of truly ethnic thing. I mean, Turks do not look at all like the Central Asian people after which they're named, and that's another point. But it's connected also with what the Byzantine Empire had been, and it's kind of an exception. But again, an entire chunk landmass of European ethnic group that is, you can't say, well, these are maybe are not kind of Europe, that doesn't quite exist, and that's why we define Europe like that. So, as we were saying before, given that the oil fields of the nomadic armies were in the steppe, so where, as we've seen, the Mongolian armies could be levied, supplied, because they also, their horses had to come back there, pastures and so on. This did not prevent Kubilai Khan, for example, from exceeding such limit. They arrived in Java, the southernmost point reached by the Mongols, and further from the steppe, albeit with little success. this is true, but at the same time, Java is somehow closer than Europe compared to Mongolia. So that's also a fact that must be taken in consideration. The logistical question must be brought back to its main nature, that is, namely, that of a place of pasture and breeding of the Mongolian horse to which the nomadic rider has to return in any case for the period of litters. And the European plains are not steppes, right? They are not suitable for this purpose. And what you have between Mongolia and Europe is also not a particularly resourceful area, for which even in the steppe you can start threatening Europe from. Right? This doesn't mean, in fact, that we have seen it. Europe was invaded, but this lack of a true bridge or power base in between the two Eurasian region would have amplified the subsistence problems of a possible invading Mongol army, not even just one that had the plan of systematically occupying Europe, which again would have required a much greater effort, and considered that the same invasion would have posed very serious strategic and logistical risks for the Mongol armies. These were not the still, however, well-organized, say, Magyar, say, armies that were at some point, even in the thousands, raiding all over post-Carolingian Europe and coming back to the Pannonian plains, in a situation where there was, in fact, no major central power. The Magyars were somewhat more contained than, even properly in terms of military potential, what the Mongols should have mobilized here, and also with much greater logistical costs, by the way. And the Mongol armies would have been quite big. They would have necessitated of constant supply lines kept open. Looting would have been possible, but you can't just walk into Europe, as we'll see now, and pretending that everything will go well. Like at every castle you have to stop, and it's going to be a nightmare, right? This is 13th century Europe. It's Europe in its prime, right? The moment of greatest boom of resources, of feudal, non-feudal powers growing, consolidating. There is already properly a monetary economy kicking in at a substantial level. There is equally a military professionalism. Lots of it is about 13th century European warfare. So something that definitely is able to sustain a very structural response. It doesn't matter how politically divided Europe was, against such a common threat. There would have been a massive reaction, evidently. So this is the point. In fact, the political military question is more stringent. On this point, for example, we have to disagree with the Friar John of Plano Carpini when he says that the polycentricity of feudal Europe and its division represented an advantage for the Mongols. Right? This must be understood in the mindset of the Franciscan, because everything had to be like that. There was the ideal of the Societas Christiana, and of course the essence that divine perfection had to be reflected on earth by a single Christian will and power and government. So a clergyman would have never said, it's fine that Europe is politically divided, and what it really meant in this regard is something that, of course, goes beyond. It has to do with properly a broader sense of, in fact, what a civilization is supposed to be, a broader concordia and statal capacity to address unitarily resources towards a common aim. So, of course, the limits existed at the time, but it's also ideal to to pretend that anyone at the time had those capacities. What country in the world was an actual state? I mean, the most advanced country in the world at the time was likely China. It's possible that Europe had already surpassed it. Um, what like you can't have a unity that doesn't exist in that world, politically speaking. It's always a decentralized reality where there is an enormous deal of autonomy. There's always a competition, a struggle for power that actually does strengthen the capacity of these states on the longer run and making them more powerful and capable, in fact, of incorporating more. And the Mongols, in this sense, know better. They are kept together by this incredible success and the fact that they can share the loot and the spoils. So the Mongols didn't fight but for winning. This is very important, right? They had such a huge amount of territories to not just to invade ex novo, but literally to just control and keeping under. That it was a huge challenge, right? Embarking themselves in the invasion of Europe would have been, even just for the sake of loot, etc., an incredible diversion of resources in an area that objectively would have even at some point retaliated. The Mongols were coming to learn directly of the Europeans, of their capacities. They probably assessed what kind of civilization was behind them and how thriving it was. Again, we do not know what the Mongols actually thought of Europe. We would like to know. We don't have the evidence of that. We can't just understand what they did, maybe in relation to that, but nobody wrote. There were Europeans that also found themselves in the Mongol armies. We know of an Englishman that eventually told a story, one of a German source that wrote about the Mongols. And there are stories of this kind, and Europeans were equally curious, because even though there is this legend that, these are demons coming from hell, Gog and Magog, and all this stuff from the Bible, but those are also a bit literary topoi, and if you look at what Europeans were doing, they realized that this was a very serious threat, but at the same time were realistic about the fact that, first of all, let's see what they actually do. Because Frederick II, for example, as Germanic emperors saw, in fact, the Mongols arriving at the gates of Germany, adopted military precautions, but if, this thing does not escalate, these guys raid, say, Hungary, Poland, whatever, even the outskirts of Germany, but they come back where they came from. This is not even technically the worst thing that can happen to you. There is something frightening about, of course, the success that these armies score, the fact that they move dramatically fast, that they're incredibly well organized, that they also are very effective from a tactical point of view. These are lifetime fighters that have found a way to sustain themselves by, in fact, destroying other countries in this punitive rates, but in fact do not have a broader interest to necessarily stick to the place if there ain't much to gain from that. And so we'll see now how complicated it was to take over countries that were covered literally in tens of thousands of castles. Doesn't matter how small maybe individually these were, but how much that altogether really meant in terms of territory connection. Well, that's something you don't have in Central Asia. Let me tell you, there may be, of course, broader environmental problems used as protection fortifications, but at the same time, these are the same ones for which locally there's not much of an enormous concentration of people. And even when there is, for example, the anecdote I always say is that the largest city in the world, before it was destroyed by the Mongols, is one that a few people even have heard of, that is Merv, the ancient Antiochia in Margiana, that also was one of the many Alexandrias that the Megas had founded. These are centers that, of course, can exist because they have agricultural surplus around, sustaining them, but that also exist a bit at the frontier between the steppe and the civilized world, in virtue, for example, of transcontinental traffics. So when you look at the broader area of Central Asia and also part of Western Eurasian steppes, you do not see real things like states, like powerful civilizational capacity deriving from like an overstructure that you can also properly graft on, and that can fortify this entire place further. No, they're mostly uninhabited lands, or sparsely populated. So, and there is not the same density that you would find in Europe. Not just of castles, but what that entails, like lots properly of communities that revolve around them, that can pay for them, that can defend them, and this happens throughout all the entire freaking place. So this was surely noticed as soon as the Mongols entered Russia, not even Hungary or Poland, and they understood that the western they went, the more they would have had to invest in power, and actually not just because of the distance, but because there was a greater power located there compared to the east. And properly, even the logistical question, if politically Europe is divided, all these communities are essentially fighting for themselves, but they're not isolated either. So they can turn every single of those castles in a hellish place. And the same goes for the surroundings, operationally speaking, and for what concerns supply lines and so on. It would not have been enough for the Mongols to win one European sovereign after another with the logic of divide and rule. Because every city, every abbey, every free commune would have involved a long and bloody siege. Like Switzerland, Bavaria, Greece would have been more difficult to conquer by a Mongolian army than Afghanistan. And you understand in this judgment how much past I'm going any consideration about those things, like, oh, but nobody ever conquered Afghanistan. No, lots of people conquered Afghanistan and maintained it for a good time, right? How many peoples have invaded Switzerland, Bavaria, or Greece, and managed on the long run to control it? Like with the Ottomans in Greece, it happened just because the Ottomans were fundamentally the same people that had dwelt within the same Roman Empire. The Ottomans, specifically the Osmanic, are on the Bosphorus, right? So those were former inhabitants of a broader area that was also kind of Hellenized. And so when we think about the Ottoman Empire, you don't have to think some random guy, some random Turk from Central Asia that one day stepped into Constantinople, began to lord over around people. The Ottomans basically substituted themselves to Byzantine rule, which is a completely different thing dynastically, and drawing, by the way, ideology from everywhere, including bearing the title of Roman emperors, and even copying papal tiaras and all these kind of things. And this is very underappreciated. So also the processes which same European countries adjusted themselves ethnically took, as you know, a lot of time. Migrations of peoples entirely. So not something that entailed like one day one guy conquered and this thing was annexed to an external power that was somewhere else, right, in the steppe, for example. No, they came to live there. Just like for the aforementioned example of the Avars or the Magyars, right? This is very important. So yes, you crash. Let's say the king of Hungary, the king of Poland, the Holy Roman Emperor, the French king. Even assuming that you make it, again, what about how do you storm the major cities in Europe? How do you besiege Venice and pretend not to lose the initiative against an entire continent that is going to oppose you from land, from sea? The Mongols do not have fleets, and the same goes for every abbey that is a castle in itself. The free communes, they're material overload. The with their pikes, their crossbows, their tactics, by the way, that combined with the knightly ones are in the Near East, proving that they can't cope, for example, against the Seljuks, and their Western tactics are evidently superior to the Middle Eastern ones. Not saying that the Mongol ones were the same, and that these were actually more advanced than the European ones, but better than more advanced, we should say more effective, for the aforementioned reasons, that these were peoples that fought and lived on horseback their entire lives. So there isn't much just of some kind of specialty that the Mongols really enact, right? If you study their tactics, we can't trace like much of an innovation compared to the previous steps once, right? More or less, they do the same thing. It's just that they do it better from a qualitative point of view, because again, they have gone beyond in the scale of their moral investment into it, which is different. Again, the standard steps tactics are pretty much the same. Again, before the Genghis Khan's Mongols emerged, there were other peoples around that at some point kind of also were superior, as we've seen. So this aspect must be understood, and it's often connected with a mechanistic, technologistic, positivistic idea of what war is, right? If you pick a 13th century Mongolian army, its superiority doesn't lay in a different type of war. It lays in the fact that these are qualitatively, morally superior forces compared to others that were met and destroyed, but that also can fit in the broader idea that yes, somebody has to lose. If you fight, especially single tactical engagements, and that's still at a strategic level. There was no broader achievement rather than this massive offensive from which the same countries managed to recover and kind of go on with their lives without an impact that you can't say, well, this brought them back to the Stone Age, or was more impacting even than the same crisis that they would trigger at the end of the century, or in the mid-14th one. And so, again, something that they were also partly habituated to, maybe not in the way it was concentrated with that Mongolian wave, but that was part of the broader system. In other words, the Mongols were not superheroes, were just, very good fighters. And very good fighters win more often than not. But again, we see them also in action against some powers. We've seen essentially a Polish-German coalition. We've seen the Hungarian army that didn't kid, because it was one of the largest in Europe, but that was again, we don't consider, for example, Hungary at the forefront of military development or quality per se, right? The major innovations and tactics and kind of even warlikeness, properly the intensity of warfare, how many moral and material resources were invested in it. But you have to look at countries like Italy, like France, and those are, again, every single step you have, say, and that's why stepping in Western Europe proper is a problem. Because think about the degree of urbanization of Italy, or the degree of encapsulation of Germany or of France. Think of even again, the Byzantine Empire there would have been a tough nut to crack, and also one that would have just been perhaps more at hand. Even the fact that the Mongols attacked Poland, arrived even up to Germany, and stayed fundamentally in Central Europe, in Hungary, and didn't wage essentially a war against the Byzantine Empire on a large scale, is indicative of perhaps what they were they were just testing in a way rather than really going serious with the whole thing. That surely could have caused an enormous harm, but again, what would have been their actual interest in doing so, and with which expectation of coming out of that alive on the longer run, right? Or let's say better, benefiting from that action on the longer run, right? Just destroying another place for what if you don't necessarily even feel threatened by it? Like, it's not that there were some plans of crusade against the Mongols, but notoriously they didn't put themselves in motion. But let's say a French would have gone fighting in Russia because there were the Mongols there. No, right? They were involved in something else. They must have stayed in France. They went to the Holy Land. They had other interests. And the Mongols probably began to understand this. I mean, they had Europeans, as we've seen, also in their own armies. They would talk to them. They would ask them things. And they would realize what that world really was. And probably they were amazed by it, right? They had surely, an admiration towards it. Surely they weren't coming as the ones who said, oh, well, we're just superior in absolute terms, so we don't care about anything and anyone. So that, this guy's accomplished something, we don't care. No, you have, exactly because they had conquered everything and everyone, they perfectly knew the difference in civilizational development, and they were very cautious in doing so, right? Even if they threatened Europe afterwards, by words, again, waging war against it seemed such a colossal enterprise in the first place that one wondered how things would have literally gone at that point. There was a risk of literally triggering channeling the European moral resources against the Mongols when things had gotten serious. Because let's be honest, it's not that people, in France cared too much about what was happening in Poland. All right, they cared, but let's say until they would have knocked at their doors, say Germany, in that sense, things would have woken up. Also because that was the empire. It was, again, an area that controlled also parts of Italy. There were deep implications in probably the international role of the Holy Roman Emperor, that at the time, by the way, was king of Sicily and ruled from Sicily, not even from Germany. But that is quite meaningful because it tells you how even more unreachable some other areas of Europe really were. And without ships, without fleets, how do you enter even the Mediterranean and the core centers of power? How do you reach, say, in fact, the same Sicily? Or how do you besiege Constantinople? It's complicated, to say the least. It can be done. Also, at least Constantinople can be besieged by land and so on. But the broader point there is that these are big centers of universal relevance that will simply not be say, okay, well, I don't care about them so much, and that would have surely threatened many of the interests of the same. Think about the Crusaders, of the papacy. The papacy would have called for crusades. Had the Mongols even decided to, say, occupy Hungary or Poland. That was just too risky, because from there, again, they could wage war on Germany and Italy and so on. So even just stepping that, probably the Mongols knew that the moment they did it was seriously triggering a response that up to that point they had not coped with. Right, so that's in a way the limit of these campaigns' meaning and testing function. Right, and by the way, we still haven't made any video on the battles, say, of Moi or Lenitz and so on, but about these battles, we should not just say, oh, look here, the Mongols crushed these guys. We should also properly look at what happened, what were the odds, and so on. So these are very often skipped as broader considerations for okay, the Mongols were just the strongest thing ever. They had to win, raise everything to the ground. Just wait for that. Because again, most of the areas that the Mongols had penetrated were not as thickly populated, connected, fortified, and productive as most, in fact, of Western Central Europe, right? Also, there is a technical issue at the end of the day, the tactical response. That is, did Europeans have the tactical tools? Let's not say to defeat the Mongols, like in open ground. Just in these battles, two Europeans gave their worst. They weren't really fighting. No, they were actually. The Hungarians were, also the Poles and the Germans were, right? So that was in many ways maybe not the best in absolute terms in that circumstance, but the good enough that makes properly the average. But let's say to put in place such a resistance as to discourage the Mongolian projects of conquest, consider this: the feudal knight in Europe was at his peak and was a very formidable opponent for the Mongolian heavy cavalrymen. Especially if we consider the 1 versus 1, there is no possible comparison, especially due to the impact force that the great European horses had, right? The Mongol horses were smaller. Properly, their warfare was not designed to have this dramatic emphasis on shock cavalry charges like the Westerners were basically specialized in topping in worldwide, arguably at that point, and that would be proven by the Crusades. So many people say, medieval armies were slow, that they didn't move as fast as the Mongols did, all these things. Yeah, but again, they didn't, because they were something else. They were heavier. They were more cuirassed on average than the Mongols were. Europeans were impressed actually by the type of Mongolian armor that they thought to be pretty weird and kind of patchy and empirically built, but it was very effective. They thought about this for a while. Then they began to say, well, but look here, it has also weak points from the back or under the armpits. During the same 13th century, you find Caucasian powers, the Cilician Armenians, hiring Frankish crossbowmen against the Mongols, also defeating them. So this initial amazement that is obvious, it was a bit like a cultural shock for people that also were not habituated to think much beyond, in fact, the continental horizons, to say, okay, well, these arrived, they kick our ass, and they are terrifying, but and let's simply write that, okay, well, it's just another people, it's not a big deal. Initially, there was that shock. There were militaristic concerns about this. There was a general uncertainty about, like, for example, why are these guys even invading us? Because it wasn't clear at all, right? Of course, there was a broader idea of world domination at the time. That was still kind of the broader point of it all. But again, if you don't even know exactly what the world is in its entirety, you see these peoples arriving. They're so different. They're nomadic peoples. They're also another race. They look terrifying. They live in in an incredibly different and frankly disgusting way. They do, and they're so morally loaded to achieve these results against you. It's a big deal. Again, there was the reference to what this was told to the King of France from those who had traveled in Mongolia. We're told, look, if you're not your noblemen, but your peasants in France would accept to eat what just the great Khan of the Mongols does, those peasants of yours would take over the world. In other words, it is that if you had the guts to eat the shit that just the top Mongolian, celestial ruler would, you wouldn't be, you could do anything else in the world. And so that actually in Europe, the degree of civilizational advancement was so great already that to gentrify, to weaken in part, from a moral point of view, the people. In other words, they were having it easier, of course, in Europe than in Mongolia, in many ways, right? And this is partly also why the Mongols were specialized in warfare so much the way they did, but not because in pre-industrial times, Europeans were joking about warfare. Actually, they were developing something extremely tough, and that other cultures such as the Byzantines and the Arabs had definitely, and the Turks also, that were actually the majority of the ethnic rulers of the Mongols in Western Eurasia, considered this to make also the Mongols aware of that in a broader sense, and they saw it. I mean, they kicked ass in Moi, Lenitsa, and beyond, but they saw what these men were. They saw that they could get themselves killed. They saw that their cavalry charges were not something you could kid with. They saw that those battles were not to be won as by the Mongols necessarily, that the odds were always somewhat balanced, and the Mongols, yes, they were better, but by which degree, and which degree of certainty that would have repeated, and that outcome would have repeated just even the next battle. And those weren't even the best feudal realities that were met with, because the cradle of feudalism was France and in England, and they had seen part of what the Germans tasted like. This is true, but they were still not a full army of that kind. The Poles were being fully feudalized by the 13th century by the Germans in that regard. They had not seen what the Italians could do. They had not seen again what the Byzantines could do. And again, do not underestimate this aspect. Also, a medieval knight is not to fight all the time on horseback. It does when, again, they count. Think about this. They can defeat the enemy, right? And in battles like, again, Moi, Lenitsa, etc., it's not that the victory happened because, Europeans said, like in movies, oh, let's attack the enemy. We're stronger, and then they get overwhelmed just because, the Mongols charge them frontally. It's a completely different thing. Those were battles that were won by the Mongols both strategically and tactically, exploiting some organizational, operational weaknesses of the enemy. They do not tell about the absolute quality of a fighting force in a broader sense. Again, even in a 1 versus 1, and again, the collective dimension is more important for sure, and the Mongols were top in that. But again, meet that knight while he's defending his own castle, and see what happens then, because it can require definitely lots of, surely more than one man to take down, and those are all losses that you have to account, especially when you're so far from your, again, I call them oil fields in this video, but you know what I mean, properly manpower centers, and properly what all serves that superiority, but by the way is a mounted superiority, or at least one that does so in a very complex and articulated manner, such as we've seen also how logistically complicated it was moving literally hundreds of thousands of horses, even for several tens of thousands of horsemen, that you have to keep functioning in an optimal way if you don't want it to turn into actually a logistical nightmare and a trap for your own army. And again, European ground was not definitely the best for that. Think about the nascent urban militias, their proud development that would have also been further stimulated by the Mongolian invasion, because there would have been a more generalized levy, political participation, something to unite against. So where the feudal knight could fail, and the feudal knight never quite does operate alone, but in open field, let's put it in this way, the porcupines and crossbows of the communal forces would have likely succeeded. Because, try to wear them out. Consider, for example, those were the same years of the wars of the Lombard League. Think about a resistance of the Lombard communal infantries for entire days under the frontal charges of the German feudal cavalry, and the repeated ones. These were men who withstood that. And that's literally stopping the frontal charge that the Mongols didn't even dare to meet in open field, because as you know, against the Westerners, they refused the center like at Lenitsa, and then hoped to envelope them with the wings of the lighter troops, etc. But try to take out, I don't know, such a militia, plus entrenched in the in the massive wall rings that were being built even beyond the Roman ones, exactly in those generations, in the Po Valley or in other areas of Europe, and trying to storm them, right? With that kind of courageous resilience, defending their own communes, talking about tens of thousands of people, and there are like 30 of these cities concentrated in a single regional theater, and they are habituated to coalesce, to form leagues and so on. And just think about what this means, plus the knights, because these all have knights, just like everywhere. And these militias are to be found pretty much everywhere. I mean, the Flemish ones, let me tell you, at that time were definitely not bad. The Bremençons were not bad. The French, the German communes, the Spanish communes, had the Mongols arrived up to the Iberian Peninsula, would have definitely not been just mildly, meekly accepting kind of the Mongols arriving to ruin their own existence, right? So the way these forces could be employed could be pervasive. They were fighting in their homeland, on the battlegrounds that they already knew much better, much deeply. Consider this, that again, when you start arriving in countries like in Flanders, in Italy, sometimes you say, well, these are kind of flatlands, right? Aside from some those that are not, but let's say these flatlands, let's say, are all crossed in canals, in ditches, in, again, fortresses everywhere. In some areas, naturally, it's full of also forests still, of swamps. So it's actually not just the open steppes, right? Doesn't matter that the steppes can be terrifying. There are terrible temperature excursions. Some areas from minus 30 degree Celsius to plus 40 from night to day. But here it has to do about properly the operational functionality of the Mongol army, of the fact that properly these peoples were able to store enormous resources to sustain sieges, to let's say to harass such a bulky Mongolian army, again, of hundreds of thousands of horses in such compressed spaces that cannot even properly even sustain the horde. I mean, you can say, well, but by eating all around, but they would have starved to death the cities. Well, and what about the army itself? We've seen the logistical needs of a Mongolian army the other day. How long can you stay in these places? Right? There are some huge grazing areas, probably, if you think about the great French plains, and so massive agricultural resources, but it's not quite the steppe. And they're heavily populated, and so they're heavily hostile. And also, the Mongols do not quite know these territories well, right? Every one of these campaigns had to be, as we've seen, carefully prepared, because they had to calculate mathematically how much for how long could that specific amount of territory sustain hundreds of thousands of horses before they had to necessarily move away, because there was, again, no way to eat anything, and you could starve and literally make the army falling apart as a consequence if you had not moved in the meanwhile. So these are all complications that in the compressed European spaces would have been really difficult to deal with. Again, a heavily encapsulated area, and the risk for the Mongols to become entangled in an interminable series of wars and guerrillas invading a virtually uncontrollable territory would have made a Mongol adventure in Europe very bloody, to say the least. And again, Wu has the moral force of saying, okay, well, I'll simply go to somewhere being massacred. For what? If you don't give them a reason, they will just not even fight. So that's not easy. The Mongols are not robots that just obey the Khan's orders. You have to give them a reason to get themselves killed. There has to be worth it. And generally speaking, the Mongols didn't send their troops to get themselves killed, nor any sensible culture or people or country does. So there is another aspect that, as far as the moral forces are concerned, we should never forget about those times and places. That is the reputation of essentially cruelty and ruthlessness. You see, great part of the reason why people don't believe at a point, at least some do, some don't, but the general idea, oh my god, the Mongols would have arrived in Europe, it should have been such a disaster for Europe, the Mongols would have not been stopped, they would have arrived everywhere in the Strait, everything, because they were so terrible. So just think this, that when the reputation of cruel and ruthless warriors that the Mongols enjoyed in Europe is emphasized, we are making a wrongdoing to the cruelty and the ruthlessness of the Europeans. I can assure you as a European that we are very aggressive. And it's literally in our, I won't say DNA because it would be then racist at that point, but it's not something you should be ashamed of. Like if a culture is not, let's say, aggressive, it's also morally weak, right? Psychology tells us, contrarily to what memes for superstitious subjected masses really think, that being aggressive, arrogant, direct, straightforward, kind of also prone to use violence as necessary, is actually a proof of strength, of confidence, not of weakness by any stretch of the imagination. Naturally, you know how to use that, and that's the entire point. But when you look at ferocity, and there are some anecdotes from these worlds that you would not like to learn about. There were Europeans, even from the most civilized areas, that literally ate each other within the context of political struggle, not because they were starving to death, but because they literally made the people to pieces and they ate them, right, because of sheer hatred. I don't have to tell you the systemic massacres that normally occurred in the broader warfare of the times, pretty much everywhere. I mean, the Europeans were capable of doing this, and as a civilization even saying, well, this is objectively kind of wrong, or at least we should think about why it's done and so on. But the massacre of the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians by the Crusaders in Jerusalem, that was normal, because any population and community that opposes you at that point becomes an enemy. So it's actually, I don't know how to tell you, but it's normal, right? Retaliation, even against civilians that pick up arms against you, is legal today. So at the time, it wasn't even just a thing in the way we intend, but slavery was pretty normal. This kind of properly of European entrepreneurship and being able to say, okay, now I will take a ship and go raid this place, and then I will force these guys to give me their port, and if they don't, I will shoot the hell out of them with my crossbows and so on, making the beautiful spring raid, massacring, raping. This was kind of normal, right? This is part of, it's a defining essence of humanity. It's not even just an opinion. And medieval Europe was radically violent, right? Again, in a functional, civilized, rational, effective, strong, successful, efficient way, but it was nevertheless radically violent. And when you have peoples that you do not even properly consider as human beings because they look like demons from hell, from the perspective, the imagination of these writers, and you see them raiding, burning, destroying at a scale, by the way, that you are not even habituated, in the sense that they can't do it. Same reason why they can't defeat you on the battlefield, because they are more apt to it systemically, but not because you cannot be morally driven at that point to actually retaliate. Well, it was normal to, say, skin people alive, to place prisoners on battle rams, say siege towers, and sending them against their own people. And these people would definitely shoot on their own people in that situation, because they knew better that if they hadn't done that, the towers would have eventually defeated them, allowed the enemy to defeat them. So we're talking about a reality that we can't even normally picture today, but that we must always be aware of at the time. I don't know if you have ever read an average medieval chronicle, like especially probably the annalistic ones of some places, especially the most civilly active, especially from late historiography. They were only making war. I mean, 90% of what they wrote is, this year 200 of the knights of the city went to raid in this district. We brought back cattle in this. On the other year, there was this uprising here, and that guy was, cut to pieces by this faction that hated each other. His gods, and his men then began a feud that never ended. So that other day, the guy in the castle rebelled, and we went there and we burned the castle down, and we pillaged the country. It's basically only this, right? The other political, kind of artistic, economical data are just randomly put here and there, but these people were normally making war all the time, which is also the reason why the entire system was divided, or better, the consequence of why all of this was divided, because these centers had individually the power of sustaining warfare on a prolonged scale. I don't know if you understand what this means. I mean, even compared to the Mongols, that's impressive, because at a certain point, the Mongols had to slow down and say, okay, we have to try to keep this thing together. Europeans literally fought for inch, and that's the same reason why we are so, united in difference, because we know how much it has costed to be Europeans and what our values really mean. So, again, if you had been a Mongol noticing this at the time, probably you would have not been very enthusiastic to get in that kind of meat grinder. And never underestimate this specific aspect. Never consider history in modernistic, materialistic, secularistic ways for which you're just thinking about a random thing hitting a random thing without picturing the fact that these are people, and that people have means, and that people can cut each other to pieces, and that there is a thing in our brain that tells us that properly, if we are under threat of life in 3 to 5 seconds, we can even profess ourselves as pacifists or whatever, but we are able to kill another human being without any problem, because we're literally designed genetically to do this. Well, at this point, you should apply this also in the historical interpretation. There is another kind of overwhelming, again, in the 1970s, we had this which is unsurprisingly the decade where IQs started going down, ever since. There was this wave of, it's obviously communistic bullshit, like, the Eastern culture was so more advanced, we Westerners were so primitive and we do not understand the depth of these peoples, whatever. So everything that the East does, of course, these people have not even ever opened a history book about the East, what they think the East is, will make you say that, we're just wrong all the time. It's just like the Vietnam War, right? And that war could not be won. Yes, because you have ever studied how, even pose yourself politically or strategically the problem of how to handle the Vietnam War. Everybody does, right? That those who say that, that war could not be won. If you think that a war can not be won independently from the side, it means that you literally do not know what war is and why they are fought. This determinism is just the measure of cultural inferiority. That is to say, historically, in the history of mankind, the only human beings who thought that something was to happen forcibly were the ones who were giving up the initiative and were ending up systematically subjugated, so that you cannot even complain today if the masses are stupid, poor, and ignorant, that they are brought down, that their rights are eroded, because those are meant to be defended by you, not by some random people out there, right? You are the one that, not just, there is a random right somewhere that somebody's stealing from you. You are the demented one who's doing stupid things to be punished because you're too imbecile to rule yourself by yourself. This happens with peoples in history as well. And I would advise these people to actually study a bit more Western history, and also, of course, the one of the rest of the world, to understand what were actually normally the balance laid, and reflecting on actually what war really is, and why certain peoples can make war successfully and some peoples can't. And of course, sometimes it happens also that doesn't really happen in the same way, but why powers and resistances, etc., happen, because that's not normally what is commonly believed, that it's a culturalist, racist idea that just the barbarians make war. No, barbarians are the ones that make war, are not capable of winning it. That's the difference. And war in itself has no positive or negative value of any kind. It's just the political meaning of that and how you do it that eventually makes the difference, and the supportability of the same. So when, for example, coming back to the point, the Mongol military and logistic organization is praised, it must not be forgotten that the Europeans, divided and conflicted as they were, nevertheless managed to coordinate sufficiently to fight in the Holy Land, for example. And even at very important levels, especially by the 13th century. But if you think about it, and just think about this the steppe warriors that took over the world without having properly ever even seen it, well, think about a Godfrey of Bouillon in today's Belgium, like it could be at the end of the 11th century. Do you think the guy had ever had an idea of what, like, Syria or Palestine really were? And this guy was able to mount a dramatically efficient expedition from Belgium to Jerusalem that really conquered the freaking place, and this without even the coordination of a king, notoriously, because at that time they were either excommunicated or still fighting each other, and the 1099 accomplishment was the one of the barons, and quite disciplined ones. This was more than 1 century before the Mongol invasions, by the way, a moment during which Western warfare had dramatically speeded up and surpassed, say, also the Byzantine one, the Arab one, and definitely was something to be reckoned with. So never underestimate medieval logistics, because that's another thing people have been wrestling with. Everybody says, look at Roman logistics. Yeah, Roman logistics was amazing. But have you ever thought that medieval logistics could actually be even more than that? If anything, just because of what it required. I mean, the equestrian culture or the metallurgical skills of medieval times of a 13th century army were just, substantially greater and superior to, say, any
classical time and required dramatic technical capacities to put armies together, and this was done regularly without any shortcoming, as it had always been done, like on average in the history of mankind. So the point of this video is obviously that not to bring down the Mongol military capacities at all, but just to realize that all these differences that we're spotting just to assess them, because we're not moral relativists, but also to realize that there were, as again in pre-industrial times, differences were relatively loose. And so that, again, even if Westerners were consistently defeated in open field by the Mongol armies, still there would have been lots of other ones to defeat. And chances are that they would have not kept just being defeated, right? Just by statistical reasons based on what we know on that type of warfare. That wasn't a joke at all, even for the Mongols. So when praising, in fact, the tactical capacity of the Mongols, due weight must also be given to the European ability to learn from their own defeats. Frederick II of Hohenstaufen and Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany, King of Italy, King of Sicily, King of Burgundy, King of Jerusalem, etc., admired Arab archers to the point of making them his own personal guard. So imagine the astonishment of the Mongols at being targeted by mounted archers of the Stupor Mundi, right? There is something about that, even properly moral effect, that even a little thing like this, like saying that, I don't know, Frederick II's Saracens of Lucera were the game changer in the struggle between Europe and the Mongols. But there are some details about the variety in development and in a multiplicity of directions, and the adaptability capacity, the fact that Europe was again living literally a boom demographically, economically, and this was reflected in their military development, that what we're seeing there, as opposed to the Mongol Empire that was essentially destined to simply crumble and Mongolia to remain Mongolia and not to become the next Europe or next China, that instead went on, in fact, on their own, in their own civilizational development, well, makes you understand that the boundary between, the what we can historically assess having happened and the likelihood of a Mongol defeat in Europe is pretty thin, right? And for whichever reasons, it was political, as we know, and we're not talking about this today. For that, I simply send you to listen the aforementioned videos. I created a playlist on medieval Mongolia, so there is not just medieval warfare, so you can check also this broader civilian if you want, even though the Mongols just made war for that matter, largely at least. I think the theoretical assessment necessary to answer a what if shows us consistently that there is something wrong with the idea that the Mongols even thought seriously at a point to not just even obviously to conquer Europe, but even just to subjugate it, to have the resources to say, okay, well, this place we know we wanna systematically subjugate, and we will dispense of it quickly. It's just, now wait, the great Khan has died, so we have to bail out temporarily, but we will come back and we will conquer you. They never thought that, right? What they did, which I think they did, is that they surely, found this other area essentially to expand and to test the limits of. They kicked ass because they showed definitely what they're made of. They found some polities that were fundamentally prepared to that eventuality, that were paid for contingental factors that, generally speaking, were also in fact divided, but exactly for this reason weren't fighting as one, so at the full of their potential, their coordination. Everything was very sudden, right? A major political and strategic factor in all this was, of course, the fact that their the thing was so sudden, right? Normally, you you see it in every international contact, like when disasters happen. At the beginning, there is a crisis because nobody's say one may think that such things can happen, but until they happen, everybody says kind of, yeah, they could happen, but for now, let's hope they don't. Because again, this is the second principle of thermodynamics. It's not really it translates itself like this in politics. But eventually things change, and warfare is a very powerful hybridizer, by the way. Things always, like, the more you're under pressure, the more you react to that, and that's also how we maintain communities together in many ways. And the Mongolians began also to learn a world that they didn't know much of, because you know that the Mongols had even Christians among themselves before they got out of, before Genghis Khan brought them out of their boundaries. That there was a broader awareness of the rest of the world. As a matter of fact, my distinct impression about the world history is that the peoples who lived at the outskirts of civilizations knew much better civilizations that civilizations knew them. And the simple reason being that those who live at the outskirts of civilization are hungrier, and thus they are ready to exploit any weakness of the bigger systems much faster. It's the same reason why you have a migration here, in a sense, but same reason why you have the second invasions and more. And surely they knew people. Europeans had gone to Mongolia, of course, before Genghis Khan. We know this. We know goods traveled across Asia. From a side to another, even in the darkest of the darkest time of contraction of demographic shrinking and so on. Like in the 7th century, we see lapis lazuli being used in European colored, say, illuminations and manuscripts. Those came only from Central Asia. So the idea is that everybody more or less knew about the world. The point is that you have to know a country very well before invading it. Any reference to current events is completely unrelated. Let's put it this way. And because, in case you didn't notice, war is a serious thing. And taking over again Europe, like in the 13th century, is not, in my opinion, for anyone. But at least it should require a capacity of assessment. And surely when the Mongols began to arrive in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, they began to assess quite clearly what they meant. It's not that they were the first civilization they saw. They knew China, they knew other countries. They could assess what Europe was made of. And they probably realized that this system was too big, right? They could perhaps launch raids, they could devastate, they could achieve some local superiority at given time, but there was no way to even just launch massive raids all across. And even if there had been, this would have come at big risks that do not seem worth to run, especially with much kind of weaker systems that are around, that you have either to bring back under control in order to terrorize adequately, and that are also much more centralized. For example, when the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, that was a pretty dark day for humanity, there is no doubt. Like, Baghdad was really a treasure of human civilization. You know, what the caliphs had stored in terms of knowledge, of manuscripts, of ancient wisdom. It was enormous. We lost that, and it's not much about the Library of Alexandria. It didn't quite disappear in the sudden way we think. It's really the destruction of Baghdad that also caused, by the way, a trauma in the Islamic world. The Crusaders, in spite of their success in Syria and in Lebanon, in Palestine, didn't affect the Islamic world more than much. Like they of course thought it was a bad thing that happened to them, but they didn't see it as a broader incarnation of the universe. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, the Islamic world was radically traumatized in ways that you can argue it could never recover from. I mean, Islam was not the same anymore after the destruction of Baghdad. And yet that was a system that allegedly had been working still in models that were inspired to the older idea of the centralized bureaucratic state with professional permanent army. It's the same reason why the Arab civilization had declined since the 11th century, and the Turks that were kind of more Persianized and also closer to the Mongols in that kind of feudal mentality had in fact feudalized, privatized the system. Same bit what happened for the Byzantines, tried to maintain that kind of older Roman model, but essentially the feudal system there was just more cost benefits desirable, and some enlightened emperors understood it, but it was somewhat too late. It's not surprised that the Crusaders took over Constantinople, and there is surely something there in the broader confrontation between the Mongols and the Europeans that would have been so fascinating just to test. I mean, I'm pretty happy that the Mongols didn't have the unconsidered thought of, say, razing to the ground Vienna, or even having pushed forward in Germany or Italy and having made some irreparable disaster. But just to know in a more visceral sense what these cultures really thought of each other, to hear their words, because at least we have a lot that the Europeans say, and frankly the attitude is, yeah, we're interested in these guys, but they're not the entire thing that is happening right now, not even the most important one, frankly. This could be a more narrowly Western European idea, because of course, a Russian or a Pole or a Hungarian would have had quite different ideas about that. But again, they were also the part of Europe that wrote less compared to the West, and that had, in this sense, suffered the Mongol attack. So you understand that there was a greater permeability there, connected with a different level of civilizational development. And surely there was some meeting point, even of Mongols and Europeans. For example, the feudal culture, because that's essentially what we're talking about. I mean, the Mongols had a very different mindset from the European one as far as different things were concerned. But say the equestrian culture, that was something that even, I don't know, the Crusaders and the Seljuks, for example, recognized in each other. I mean, they hated each other guts, but they also respected each other. They respected the fact that there were these great lords that commanded many men that were proud and skilled and trained, and they knew horses and cavalry tactics and how to move such large amount of people and animals with great, political, strategical competence. And surely there was some approach of this kind. The Mongols, as far as we know, at least when they started lording from China, and they began also to, let's say, to distance themselves from Europeans, began to threaten them even in more direct ways. We know of the letter to the Pope, to the Emperor, and just it was, you have to bow to us because we are the leaders of the world, and we give you this magnanimously this opportunity to to become our subjects. And there is the answer of Frederick II that said something like, to the great Khan, I accept to resign from Holy Roman Emperor if you, great Khan, grant me a job as a falconer at your court, right? That Frederick was very passionate about bird hunting. He even wrote a treatise about that. And I think in that irony from the most enlightened ruler in Europe at the time, in a world also torn apart from the within, from all the clashes, in fact, between the papacy, the emperor, the Guelphs, the Ghibellines, the the broader alliances, say the England, France, that can participate in that German policy and so on. An answer like that, in front of somebody who tells you, just surrender, because we are the conquerors of the world, is, in my opinion, what makes... I'll be honest about that. It's about the Western moral superiority in front of the world. It's the capacity of ironizing on even the greater ideas of what that idea of world domination and accomplishments that are always, and this was ingrained also in the broader morals of the time, are always temporary, right? And that European civilization went on. The Mongol one didn't. It fell. It reverted to actually the civilizations that existed before. I mean, the Mongols remained what they were. And in this regard, I do not believe, as a Clausewitzian, that there was a room for the Mongols taking over Europe. There's really not. I mean, it's that simple, it's that crystalline when you actually picture it, beyond any other technical issue that people mostly fixate on for, let's say, for that kind of deterministic, materialistic, and fundamentally pessimistic mindset that probably doesn't want to realize what history is made of, in my opinion. And again, this is such a huge topic that would deserve much better insight. And I've been covering a lot of Mongolian history recently. We will paradoxically do it more, let's say, more in depth as far as the Mongol army organization, tactics, armament is concerned. We will talk about battles, of course. I'm preparing just one, not about involving the Mongols, but at the same time we will get to it, and so observe things a bit more close. But there is space for other broader considerations, not just from question and answer videos, but also from general in-depth content that we can make at a point. Like, I follow a schedule, as you know, that is based on quite, like, basic aspects, say in-depth, but still somewhat scanned like that, in also a repetitive fashion. But it's important at a point also to kind of comprehend the whole thing. And so videos like this, as crazy as they are, because they they tend just to cover too much at a time, but still with my formula this allows to consider several times in a single video, as you understand from the length. I think is important. It's a bit more like a a comprehensive regrouping kind of element that helps connecting this channel with other content, both outside and within it. And so I think that we're doing, after all, good. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.